Researchers have looked at factors that either enhance or detract from eyewitnesses accurately remembering things. Here are some points from Harvard psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, her book Eyewitness Testimony, and Professor Kenneth Higbee's book Your Memory, How It Works and How to Improve It, as discussed by Glenn Miller, and see the supplement for the links. So look at two time periods here, the memory acquisition and then later the retention and retrieval. So factors that enhance memory acquisition. First would be exposure time. More exposure time produces better memory. Researchers are often looking at very brief exposure time, like a couple seconds or milliseconds to a certain picture or a couple seconds to a certain fact. But Jesus' disciples had multiple years living with him. So certainly a wonderful exposure time. Frequency. The more frequent, the stronger the memory. Jesus' disciples heard him preach the same things over and over and watched his actions over those 3 years. So lots of repetition. Another factor is detail salience or interest. Researchers show that if a person is personally interested in some aspect of the things they're remembering, they're much more likely to be accurate in their memory. Jesus' disciples were obviously passionately interested in Jesus and his movement, so that would be a great factor helping them to remember what they're learning. Another one is visualization. This is a powerful technique for remembering things, and Jesus used it frequently in giving object lessons to his disciples. He would connect his teaching to physical things that they saw in front of them, or saw every day, like a farmer sowing seed, a shepherd caring for his sheep, birds eating food, grapes on a vine, the mustard seed, all sorts of visualizations that Jesus used. Another one is mnemonics and songs. This is another powerful memory tool. There's evidence of these tools used to help people remember parts of the gospel message in the early Christian church during that time of oral transmission. For example, Paul quotes several songs in some of his epistles and poetic creeds from earlier times. We'll talk about 1 Corinthians 15 shortly. And it's interesting that much of the specific verbiage of what Luke records from the time of Jesus' birth many decades earlier is in the form of poetry or songs, like Mary's song, Zechariah's song, and so on. Another factor that researchers talk about for memory is the type of fact. Certain types of fact are harder to remember, like exact dimensions or ages or times or speeds from decades ago. The Gospels mostly don't give this exact level of details. For example, they talk about Jesus being about 30 years old or about being about 25 or 30 stadia away from the shore. So these are things that could be remembered for decades. But if a person had a good visual memory or a reason to remember certain details, like John reporting exactly 6 stone water pots, or having counted the exact number of 153 fish that they caught in John chapter 21, verse 11, having told that story repeatedly over the years, then details could be remembered too. It's not just something that he's trying to bring out of his memory from 30 years ago. It's something that he's been telling over and over. Another factor that memory researchers talk about is violence, trauma, and stress. A little stress can actually increase memory, but extreme or violent stress or trauma can decrease memory. Now, most of the situations we see in the Gospels were not from extremely traumatic or violent incidents, so this factor is not relevant either way. The one exception might be in the Garden of Gethsemane, but again, there were a lot of people there, so they can pool their memories together to see what happened. Another factor that researchers talk about is pre-knowledge. Researchers have shown that if people are told in advance what they're about to see, they're much more likely to remember it. So Jesus told his disciples many times what would happen to him during that final week in Jerusalem. So although they did not understand at the time, they remembered it afterward, and his pre-warnings probably helped them to pay special attention during that time. They knew this is going to be a significant week as he came to Jerusalem. And think about this, Matthew 16:21, 17:22, 20:17, 26:2, and so on. Now, what about memory retention and retrieval? Regarding the retention interval, obviously the shorter the time period between the event and when the witness tells others about it, the more accurate the memory typically is. In the case of the disciples, they were starting to proclaim what they had seen just days or weeks before. This is much shorter than what memory researchers typically test. Their studies typically test intervals of many months or years, but the disciples were just talking about something they'd seen a couple weeks before. Next, the context of the retrieval. It turns out that details remembered in a similar context as where the memory was first made tend to be more accurate. So when the disciples were preaching in Jerusalem just weeks after they had watched and listened to the Jesus on the same streets. It'd be the perfect setting for memory retrieval. Post-event information from others or from first retelling. So researchers have shown that witnesses can add details to their memory based on what they hear from other witnesses. And this could be either a positive or negative thing, obviously in a courtroom situation. But this likely enhanced all their memories about the events of Jesus' final week, the Last Supper, and so on. This phenomenon is why police try to separate witnesses of a crime as soon as possible and interview each one separately rather than all at once, to get each one's separate perspective rather than all of them conforming their memories to what the others say, because each witness remembers different details. Interestingly, the four Gospels do present some differences which seem discrepant from each other on the surface, but are reconcilable. For example, exactly how many women went to the tomb on the resurrection morning, what day the Passover meal was, what time Jesus was crucified. There's a lot. We can talk about some of these later. But this indicates some level of independence and eyewitness testimony. Researchers have also found that the memories become more permanent and solidified once they're first recalled and reported to others. They're less likely to be changed after that. In the case of Jesus' disciples, since they had already memorized Jesus' teachings and preached it to others before his death, those memories were well consolidated already. And regarding Jesus' death and resurrection, they were proclaiming what they had witnessed less than 2 months after it happened, so those memories would have been consolidated and frozen and solidified so that they'd be accurate even decades later. Researchers have shown that if a memory persists in a person's mind for 5 years, it's very likely to stay for the next many decades. Finally, the 12 apostles would have been the guardians of the teaching for the first years. So if someone had tried to tell a story incorrectly about Jesus, the apostles could correct it. For example, Paul mentioned in his letter to the Galatians, written around 50 AD, that he had previously stayed with Peter for about 2 weeks to learn about Jesus. And then 14 years later, he had gone again to talk with the apostles and double check with them that the message he was preaching was correct, just showing again that role that the 12 apostles had in guarding and preserving the message as official guarantors of that message. So in summary, all these factors from memory researchers point to the fact that Jesus' disciples were very well prepared to remember Jesus' teachings. They had been gone out and shared his teachings while he was still alive. The disciples didn't wait for 30 years to start talking about their memories. They were talking about them right away. And within a couple weeks, the disciples' individual memories would have been transitioned to collective memory as the group, as they frequently discussed their memories of Jesus together. So when people talk about oral tradition, this is not a telephone game scenario. This is a situation where a large group of people were preaching regularly about things they had recently seen. They kept preaching it day after day. Their accounts settled into a standard pattern, became well known, memorized, and eventually they were written down by some of the disciples in the form we have today. And again, here's a diagram illustrating that process.